think.
Hello, friends. We are back. So it's been a couple weeks. Well, I'm going to back up. So you welcome back to Enlightened Health and Healing, where we are bringing conversations about physical, emotional, spiritual. Wow, I missed one. Mental, physical, emotional, spiritual well-being, conversations, ideas, and solutions to all of you for both things that myself and Christy have experienced and or have been in conversation of in other people's experiences. And we're back after a couple weeks of conflict, so we had to adjust a little bit. And we're back with a big conversation, and that is the conversation about conversation. Conversation about those tough things that we can get into, those tough moments that we can perhaps feel like, oh, how do I deal with this? What do I do? And what emotions might show up, and also what best approaches myself and Christy recommend within that spectrum. Christy, did I miss anything in that before we go too far?
No, I definitely think you got it all. Conversations about conversations. Let's talk about talking.
Yay, we get to talk about talking. And I want to give a shout out to Dorothy. Thank you for joining us this morning. Always good to see you and have you here. Okay, so we're talking about communication. We're talking about conversations with people. Why don't we kick it off by just starting knowing we are thinking challenging, tough conversations. The first thing I want to mention is my personal belief is everything is always as only hard as we make it. And is only as hard as we and uncomfortable as we choose it to be. And if we can just make a little shift of making those quote unquote tough conversations more as I'm just engaging in a conversation as opposed to a tough conversation, it can actually, in that simple art, make it easier. With that being said, what are some of the examples that we can think of of when someone would have a moment of engaging in something that could be provide them perhaps some resistance or hesitation of why to engage in that conversation?
Can you repeat the question again exactly?
Yeah. So I thought that a good way for us to get started is why don't we come up with a couple examples of when someone may have a moment of that toughish conversation that they may have to engage in. The first that I can think of is a conflict of relationship, a conflict of opinion.
Mm-hmm. I can also think of just in a workplace environment, something more feels confrontational, whether it's an employer to an employee relationship or vice versa, or even on like an equal playing kind of field. Bringing something up that might be uncomfortable, that might challenge the other person, is sometimes a difficult thing to approach, being the person to initiate the conversation.
Don't you think that can happen whether it's employment or personal related?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. And I think one of the notes that I had written is I think that depending on if it's relationship, what relationship in that sphere, whether it's someone close or whether it's someone more acquaintance related, or whether it work relationships like you had mentioned, those conversations to me can look much different in approach and in the desire to even engage it at times.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like even sometimes the people who are closest to us, it might be even be more challenging to sometimes bring those things up because we, to your point before, we make it harder. We make it mean more than it may need to, as opposed to just engaging a conversation. Whereas with like an acquaintance or somebody that we're not as close to, it doesn't feel as heavy and doesn't have as much pressure around it necessarily.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right. So first, and especially knowing a topic that's very important to us, and I know all of our viewers, is the impact of poor communication. When I think of poor communication, and I think of what we're bringing here on the show, you guys, poor communication can cause disconnect. It can cause anxiety. It can cause panic attacks. It can cause loneliness. It can cause guilt. It can cause shame. All of those factors. Christy, did I miss any in there?
No, I don't think so.
I did a quick pull of statistics, and I wasn't able to find as good of statistics on the relational side of things, but on the employment side of things, on average, 50% of employees don't feel like there's good communication. And I felt that that was alarming, especially knowing the growth of mental health and mental wellness and emotional wellness issues within not just the workplace, but also expanding that to the home life.
Yeah, that's higher than I would like it to be, you know.
Well, and I think it's a matter, if I would think about those statistics in whole, I would assert that it's probably similar or more outside the work environment. Just the difference of it's easier to get surveys, right, within a work setting.
Right. It's easier to get surveys, and I would feel like in a workplace environment, there's usually, I would feel more specific opportunities to have communication like that present, whether it's staff meetings or whether it's lunch. Like there's usually opportunities built in, whereas in a home environment or in interpersonal kinds of settings, there's not always that built-in opportunity to, unless it's planned and discussed ahead of time, like, okay, every Friday night we're going to have a conversation to make sure that anybody who's got anything to say, whatever's been going on for you or in our family, between us and our relationship, we
Right.
can air those grievances and get them out so that they don't build.
Yeah.
Which I think can be really healthy to do. We've talked about that before.
Yeah, I used to call it, when Bo was growing up, we called it a safe zone. So there was always the safe zone. The safe zone was the living room, and no matter what he had to bring us, no matter how much good, bad, if he felt a certain way about even anything Joel or I said, like that, that was a safe space. And of course, I mean, ideally, you want it to be the whole house, and you want all things to be a safe space. The thing that I found of why we made the living room a safe space is it actually brought us all into the same space to say, okay, let's talk. Let's see how everything's going. Let's do a pulse check, to your point, about where the communication of life is and where each person is at. And I think that's a good strategy that we can come back to.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing because sitting here, knowing what I know and doing what I do, I'm like, I probably should implement something like that with my kids, because I feel like I try to have very good communication with them on a regular basis, but there's nothing structured
Yeah.
around it where like every, like the living room being the safe space, or this day and this time, we're going to make sure that anything that might be on your heart or your head from the whole week gets addressed so that you're clear, so to speak. We don't have any structured, systems around that.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be helpful to make sure that nothing gets missed.
Yeah. I think it, at least from my example, from my experience, I mean, keeping it fluid's really good. Having that dedicated, okay, every time around dinner, every time, like from a relational perspective, and I'm jumping ahead to strategies, but from a relational perspective, my husband and I for a long time had every Friday was our dedicated Friday mornings when he got home from work. This is when he was on third shift, was our dedicated time. And that was our 1 hour every week religiously that we just talked about all the stuff that happened throughout the week and all the seemingly conflicting moments that we may have had during the week so that we could squash them and get them out of our space so that we could keep the health. Now, I don't want to give the impression at all that you don't talk throughout the week either, right?
Right.
Like this is in addition to normal conversation, normal bringing things up in the open, but making sure that if that didn't happen, you have that dedicated time. But I can
Right.
tell you throughout the years, for us anyway, it's shifted. That's not necessarily our same approach now. Now we pretty much have a quick powwow every day and just have that dedicated commitment to each other that we have that time to connect.
Right. And I think sometimes, I mean, like you said, having a space set every week is sometimes very helpful to, if things accumulate, if you don't get to it, if life happens and gets in the way, you have something available to you. But I would feel, at least for myself, and I could see this happening with my kids as well, that as humans, sometimes we either forget about things or they no longer are important to us several days later. And so sometimes dealing with them in the moment is more effective than waiting several days when it may have calmed down. And sometimes waiting several days can actually be helpful because it allows tempers to cool and things to calm down before addressing it.
Yeah,
It's all over the map.
I have another thought on that one. Sometimes it just doesn't matter.
Also
And
true.
and you know what? I think that we can get so wrapped up in, oh my gosh, you did this. when did we lose sight of just letting things kind of, I'm going to say it this way, letting people be who they are? One of the notes I wrote is I think that through time we have a habit of getting tripped up by other people's normal behaviors and their normal habits, and calling that a certain thing. And those, what I hear in that for me is, those are the moments that I just have to breathe for a minute and say, yeah, that's just, they're being themselves. And who am I to call them wrong of them being themselves or saying anything in that moment? So I think it depends on the situation and the person, perhaps even.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. This is totally bringing something up for me from this morning that I'm
Yeah.
not sure if I want to bring up live, but you know what, I'm going to right now. My son had something happen this morning. So it was my oldest. He was making breakfast, and this is, we've had conversations about this in the past one-on-one. He's very sensitive to when he makes food for the family, so to speak. He feels very hurt when people don't eat it or they want to make something else.
Yeah.
And so my younger son started making hot dogs for breakfast, and he was really hurt by that, and he started lashing out. He started getting very angry, and he kind of went over and like threw a couple articles of his clothing, his brother's clothing, that were sitting on the table that were already folded. And I had a very simple conversation with him of like, what's really going on for you right now? Like, you're acting disrespectfully, but what's really here for you right now? And for him, it was the hurt that people that weren't going to eat what he made. And I'm like, it's one of those situations where all those feelings are okay. The behaviors are not necessarily okay.
Mm.
But I want to acknowledge the feelings that you have, and also recognize it's okay if they don't want to eat your thing. It doesn't mean anything less about you or who you are, what you've done. You did an amazing thing, and I'm going to eat what you made later.
Yeah.
But that's just what came to me in this conversation. And like, I was going to bring it up to you later anyway. So if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love them.
Yeah. So I think that in some extent comes back to what you mentioned before of, he is definitely the one who in the moment is going to share his feelings. And I think that, and granted, he is still his age, right? He's still only 11. So it's a different concept. But
Yeah.
when I think about that, I come back to the comment that you made, and then we'll circle it all back around. The one thing I think of is, if you wait a minute and then it wasn't all that important 2 days ago, 2 days later, was it really important to even say in the moment?
Mm.
If you've already let it roll off and 2 days later it's like, whatever, not really important to me anymore.
Right. But in the moment, it was critically important to him.
Right. Him, that experience, yes. And 2 days later, he might say the same thing. Oh, no big deal in the moment. And I think for Evan's perspective, and for that, it's more his age, it's coping. In those moments, we have to know how to cope, to say, okay, now, number one, I got to self-question, is this just a trigger for me? Like, is this some shit I got going on and this has nothing to do with the other person? Or is this truly something that hit me in a way that I want to address, which circles it back as well. But I think that, to your point, and with his situation, it also comes to, again, that coping, and maybe having that dedicated time to say, okay, on these days, those are dedicated time that your meal is getting honored and everyone's going to eat your meal. But on other days, if the other boys want to make their own meals, they have that latitude.
Right.
And just setting that boundary in the upfront.
Good thoughts.
The other thing that I come to in all of this, that I stand as number one, is with all communication and people interactions, it's just a sheer understanding of each other and communication patterns of not just who that person is, what their natural behaviors are, but what is their natural way of communicating. And if we did more of that, how much would it on the back end resolve some of that tougher conversation, just because we know each other, right?
Right. And not and to your point also, just respecting that other people have their different styles, and that's okay, and doesn't mean anything about me necessarily or the person that we're having a conversation with. It just, that's who they are, that's who I am, and we can find ways to just respect and honor that person's style and who they are.
Right. Okay, so I want to come back to all of this, but I want to note Dorothy. Yeah, it happens.
You and Evan can have a conversation, Dorothy,
and thank you, Dorothy, for the comment. Good stuff here. So can we do this? Can we bring it to a real life example, right?
Sure.
We're talking about a tough conversation. We're talking about, okay, let's first, maybe we'll do a couple examples, couple scenarios perhaps. So why don't we do someone close, that person who is in our close sphere, what I call my top 5, my 5 people who within my world, they're the people who are closest to me. They know me most intimately. They are the ones who I trust call me out on my shit. They're the ones who I trust have my back no matter what. They're kind of our top circle that we know no matter what, they're the ones who always have us, right?
Yep.
So for those people, let's say, for example, something occurs that there's a massive trigger. How about a trigger for us that just gets us in a way to say, oh my gosh, that was really hurtful and harmful and really made me feel small or insignificant. Have you ever had those moments, Christy?
Never.
So we have that moment, we feel a certain way. I do think, and all this is relative, you guys, right? Because the fact is every relationship is different. So, and every scenario is different, and how we respond is different. I can say for me, the first way that I would probably respond is one of two. First would probably be, I'm the kind of person who may immediately say, Christy, this is what you said. Here's how I heard it. Is that what you meant? It is my favorite phrase, because in that sentence, you can squash so many things so quickly. And it's one of the things that is often missed, because the other thing we could do is sit back for a minute and say, why did they do that? What a jerk. What a this and what a that and make all these big stories in our head, right? Or third scenario, we could pull it back and say, what did this trigger in me? Why did this trigger in me? What story is it about me? I feel like there's another scenario in there, but before I keep going, Christy, thoughts on any of those so far?
So you know which way I usually go?
Yes.
My technique usually is the, okay, this is what it brought up for me. Why did it bring it up for me? And then I try to figure it all out. And sometimes that's not always healthy. I love your first one, and I think it's worth repeating. If you could repeat that verbatim, if people want to take notes on that, because that line is, like you said, it's instrumental in having one-on-one conversations, and it's so simple.
Yeah. Guys, it is my favorite phrase. And I can tell you, I learned this one years ago in leadership training, and I use it at home. I use it with employees. I use it with clients. And it's as simple as this. It's qualifying. It's saying, here's what you said. It's repeating back what the person said. Here's what I heard, meaning this is the way you received what they said. And then a question, is that what you meant? So Christy said, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but you say something, you repeat it. Is that what you meant? The other phrase that you can use, and I use this one to my husband sometimes, and I'll say something like, honey, the story I'm building in my head about what's going on is da 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 da. What is your thought? And he'll usually say, that's the wrong story, so just get out of there. So you have fun with it, lighten it up a little bit. And I think that would be a good example of, the first one may be one that I'll use more with an employee, more professional, maybe outside of my sphere, whereas husband, soul sister, friends, like that would be more of that. Here's the story I'm building. Here's the shit that's going on in my head. Tell me I'm not crazy. And those are the ways to have fun with it, is to, and again, lighten the air. But
Yeah.
I can tell you notoriously, when I use that line, it saves me time, energy, and emotions. And I just
Agreed.
want to give a shout out. Thank you, Dorothy, for that one.
I love that. And Michelle is on Facebook. Michelle Lee is on Facebook and says, my favorites with hearts.
Yeah. Thank you, Michelle.
So, yeah, no, I completely agree on all of that. And what's interesting, and maybe you have a thought on this, is I find that depending on what state we're in, it's easier to do one of those things more so than the others, right? If we're very acutely aware and we're in a stronger emotional state, then it can be easier to catch it when it's happening and go, okay, you know what? I don't want to build a stupid story around this. Let's just clear the air immediately and clear it right now. As opposed to if we're emotionally heightened from something else, or if something else is going on in our world that makes us feel a certain way or act and receive those things in a certain way, it could cause us to go down other pathways that might not be as empowering.
Yeah. Yes. And I believe that experience shifts it. I believe that the person that you're talking to can impact it. And personally, I think what you said it, and I'm going to take it one step further, just how it hits us, right? Like we all have our bag of stuff that we carry. And if it's, I have it that if it's something that hits that certain rock, it's going to impact us differently than if it just hits something that's not as important to us.
Yeah, absolutely. What I was going to say on that is I've taken that to mean if someone says a joke or even something serious about something that we are already insecure about in some way,
Yeah.
it strikes a bigger chord than if, I'm sorry, if you say something about my hair, I kind of like my hair. You're not, I don't really care what you say about my hair. But if you say something about another area that I might be more insecure about within my own self, that's going to send me down oh, this is what she really thinks of me, even if it's not what you meant.
Yeah. And ultimately, dialing it all back, it still comes down to the conversation of self-worth and self-love. Because if you have self-worth and self-love, it doesn't impact you as much. But I think that for me, at least, when we're talking about these conversations, it's less about that. And it's more about the actual relationship and the actual what's going on, especially in that close sphere. When we're talking about employee relationships, I think it may be a bit different. Dorothy has a good question. What if your husband gets defensive thought when you ask him if that's what you meant? So, Dorothy, what I would recommend on this, so Joel and I have been together. We've been together for almost 23 years. Wow. Okay. So sitting in that thought for a minute, I can tell you that for years, Joel would get, and I love him to pieces, and I know he's going to respect me saying this live. He would get defensive when I would bring certain things up. And the thing that I learned throughout time is two things fold. And gratefully, I had the leadership behind me that I could come from a different approach, that I would actually recognize, how would you deal with this if it was an employee? And I admittedly use that knowledge in this. But first and foremost is, you may be triggering something in him that is one of his rocks. You may be triggering something in him that makes him physiologically feel like his 13-year-old. And he just wants to scream because the 11-year-old doesn't necessarily know, here's how to handle a situation. And so there's that. And the other piece is, I tend to find coming at it in a way that, again, can further reduce that barrier, that what I call proverbial brick wall. So I would just invite you to look at how you're approaching him, of how you're approaching him in a way is right now, is it putting up his brick wall? And if so, can you approach it in a way that breaks that down? But then what I would do, and what Joel and I have done a lot throughout the years, and what's really grown us most in the last 9 years in our relationship, is we kind of we have a pact. Like, my go-to is, like, with him, I'll get quiet, right? With me, he'll get angry. So those are our go-to emotions. And when he gets angry, he tends to walk away. When I get sad or emotional, I tend to close in. And we have a pact that when he gets angry or I get sad, we call each other out. So it's not acceptable. Like, if he gets angry, he might breathe for a minute, and then we're going to circle it back and say, All right, are we ready to regroup? And if I close in, he's always going to say, okay, are you going to keep talking? You can let me know what's going on. And I would invite you to do the same with you and your husband, to just make the agreement that you're not coming from a place of attacking. You're not coming from a place of saying he did anything wrong. You're coming from a place of helping to understand. And if you can have that conversation when he is in a more grounded emotional state, when you have moments like this, it will break down some of that defense. Christy, do you have anything to add on that one?
I love everything you said. And the only other thing I would add in, this is almost a cliche thing, but it's always relevant, is speaking in the I feel statements. And so
Okay.
instead of simply saying, is this what you meant? It really adding in that first component of what you said is, this is what you said. I feel it triggered something in me. This is what I'm feeling about it, which has nothing to do with necessarily what you said. This is in my world, how my head interpreted what's going on. Is that what you meant? So you really make ownership and take ownership about how you received it. I do find sometimes that has less of a triggering defensiveness in someone when you're communicating.
Yeah. Always I own all your feelings. Agreed. Good. Okay, so coming back to the original. So I'm missing a step. So we have the conversation, we have the communication, we engage that tough, what could be tough conversation. What's next?
Hearing what the other person says and really listening.
Yep.
And listening to listen and understand, not just listening to respond.
Yeah.
And I think us as human beings, we can all get into patterns like that where, someone is saying something and you immediately have a thought, or it's like, well, that's not true, or whatever you want to respond with. But instead of jumping to those conclusions right away, really hearing and understanding their perspective.
Agreed. I like to say listening for growth, and listening to know that it's going to grow the relationship. It's going to grow you. The other thing that I think that, and I don't know why we do it as humans, but there's oftentimes we look at differing opinions as bad. And I believe that causes so much conflict. And if we can just agree in communication that, hey, we're disagreeing and that's okay, because that just means we're different people, it can really break down so many walls of communication and honoring those differences within it.
Yeah. It's humorous, and it's such a silly example, but it's the breakfast example this morning. My son had it that making hot dogs for breakfast was stupid and terrible. Now, for the record, I really want to clear it up. You guys know how healthy I am. These are organic hot dogs. They're not like commercial junk.
Oh, no, Christy, we know you're giving your kids hot dogs. You shared it.
I had to clear it. Because it was
in front
there.
of the millions.
My oldest had it that having hot dogs for breakfast was stupid and it's a waste, and whatever else he built behind that. And it's a silly, childish kind of example, as opposed to the bigger things we're kind of talking about here. But sometimes it's easier to hear it when it is a silly example like that. It's just a simple disagreement in opinion. Who cares if he wants hot dogs for breakfast?
Yep.
It's protein. Great. He had some protein and fat before going to school. It's going to keep him emotionally and blood sugar stable. He chose to make eggs and chicken sausage. Also good. No one's wrong.
Yep. Yeah, I agree with all of that. And okay, so coming back to all of that and all the strategies as we think, understanding each other and each other's communication patterns. That also includes something you just said, understanding the style of how someone brings someone in, gaining agreement that you'll respect other people's perspectives and respect other people's opinions. And along with that, allowing all spectrums of feelings. Anyone who's close to me knows that if you're angry, give it to me angry, like get it all out. Let's get it all out on the field and let's go from there, because sometimes it's stuffing them and actually makes communication worse.
Yep.
And actually can stuff things. And that's why it keeps coming up over and over and over and over and over again, because we didn't actually share the feelings that we were feeling in the first place. With that, I like to say, how can you actually loosen things up? How can you have fun with it? How can you have fun with the seemingly conflict that's happening and the feelings that are coming behind it? Because when we have fun with it, I really believe we work through it quicker and easier and more effectively, and actually can laugh about it on the back end And as I'm saying it in this moment, potentially prevent for future the same argument.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's always easier when you laugh through something. And this is sometimes easier with the kids, sometimes in my world as well. Watching them throw a little temper tantrum about something. And my kids will do it when one of them is throwing a fit, that they realize how kind of ridiculous it is. And then if one of them starts laughing, it breaks the state of the person who's in the negative place.
Yeah.
And changes the entire dynamic of what's going on. And it's beautiful when that happens, even though it almost breaks every part of who I am to start laughing when they're not in a happy place. It makes me feel an uncertain level that if I start to make light of it, or if I start to be jovial, it's disrespecting where they're at. And in reality, it's not necessarily that. It's just bringing light to the situation.
And it's breaking the emotional pattern.
Right.
Yeah. And you're teaching them that allowance of breaking it up.
Right. And sometimes it's hard to do. So how do you do that when it's difficult?
How do you lighten up the air when it's difficult?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I know one thing I've used in the past when I'm conscious enough to think through it is, if I could laugh about this in a week, why wouldn't I start now?
Yeah. I think it's situational based in some cases. And I think it's really, for me, as I think about it and ponder your question, it's how we respond to all life things, really. You know, when I think of when Bo was growing up, I always had the, like, I'm going to celebrate the spilt milk. I'm going to celebrate the mistakes. I'm going to celebrate the seemingly that might make certain feelings feel. If you do the same in conversation, it can lighten up just life, really. Life is heavy enough with communication. Life is heavy enough with all the things that we think and feel. And, you know, we can get stressed about finances or relationships or work. That anytime I think we can lighten things up, we should. So circling back to that point, Christy, I think that it's, number one, situational, especially with kids, right? Because you want to make sure that they're hearing the expectation, right? And they're hearing, like, we got to do this. This is life stuff, to know how to cope and how to do this and how to do that. But on the back end, if you can, wherever you can bring in the lightness, doing so, I think is good.
Yeah, absolutely. All the lessons.
Yeah. So the other points I wanted to recircle back to, this was perfect. How can you loosen things up? I know I mentioned it, but I want to reinforce it, guys. Respecting unique quirks, respecting just who each other is. And, you know, especially when you're with someone for 23 years, there's going to be little things that kind of, if you let it, it could get at you. Whereas if you take it as, that's why I love that person, and that's what I appreciate about that person, it brings a whole different energy. Because I don't know, Christy, your thoughts on this, but I really believe that emotions spiral. And if we're picking apart people, and if we're finding the seemingly what we call bad habits in people, which was really judgment, and everybody knows how I feel about that, it spirals, because then we see that in other people, right? And then we tend to, with people, do that with that person. And that's not respectful of us. That's not us respecting other people's quirks and uniqueness.
Yeah. The one thing I heard from all that is, and for myself, I go to a place of picking myself apart more so than picking someone else apart.
Yeah.
Which is just as detrimental.
Yeah. More so. Yes. Both are bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. And harmful. Okay. The last thing that I want, well, two more that I wanted to mention. We already mentioned the safe space, really creating that allowance of everyone being able to openly share their perspectives and opinions. But finally, I want to talk about normaling conversations and just normalizing talking about things, normalizing just being open about, again, why does it have to be a challenging conversation? Why does it have to be confrontational? Why can't it just be a conversation? Why can't we just have a conversation and it doesn't have to have any label behind it? I know, and I may have shared this in previous lives, but for a long time, I had it that having certain conversations meant I was disrespectful to other people. And I have a strong value of never disrespecting myself or others. Like it's a core innate value. And in my growth years and in just my learnings, sometimes normalizing and hearing how other people handle things really helps you understand how you can handle things in a different way, in a different approach. And I really believe if we could just normalize getting in communication with people when we see certain disagreements or when we see certain emotions show up, it could prevent so many things for the future, not to mention the mental and emotional wellness side of things.
Yeah, I absolutely agree completely with all of that. It's one of my favorite things to just normalize being normal, because
Yeah.
we're all human beings at the end of the day, and we all have our wide range of feelings and how we receive stuff and have to navigate all that process. The other thing that occurred to me is, especially when initiating that conversation that might quote unquote feel confrontational, and it doesn't have to be that way. What came up for me is sometimes just taking away the assumption of how they're going to receive it, or the assumption of how they're going to respond. Because I know I've done that before, like in this conversation of something I have to address later on. I'm already making it heavy before even starting the conversation.
Yep.
And it doesn't have to be that way.
No. Yeah. You said it beautifully. Don't anticipate what they're going to do or say, because you really don't know. And if you anticipate it, it might happen that way in self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Gabe, thank you for joining us. And I want to give a shout out to Gabe for a minute. If you're not familiar with Gabe, definitely connect with him on LinkedIn. And if you're looking for other really great shows and other great content, he has an amazing feed currently out there of other shows that you can connect with. So thank you for that, Gabe, and all your constant support with everybody. And we hope you have a wonderful Friday weekend too. Yes. Good. Okay. Tough conversations, communication, bridging that gap, helping it just not for us in those moments, but really the impact of all of our health for in all areas. So any final tips, Christy, as we wrap up today's show? I know we're running a little bit over, but good. Worthwhile content to do so.
Yeah. I think the one, at least my take home from everything that we said, is it doesn't have to be a hard conversation. Like the title of this was having the difficult conversations. They don't always have to be difficult. It's just, what if we just label it as having a conversation, or not even label it as having a conversation, is just communicating and just talking and learning more about each other and growing through whatever it is.
Yeah. Yes. And I just thought of one other thing. Get help. If you have certain conversations that, especially at work, but even at home, if you have certain conversations that you're uncertain of how to engage in, get feedback from a mentor, get feedback from someone else, or have someone join in the conversation and perhaps mediate the communication so that both sides can see both sides if it's gotten to that point. So awesome content today. Great conversation. And guys, as always, I want to just reiterate the fact that everything of what we do causes and impacts us in some way, shape, or form. And especially when we're talking about communication and relationships, but in all spectrums, if you're ever struggling in any way, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, reach out to either Christy or I anytime. And if you're ever to that point in life that you feel lonely, if you feel despair, if you feel like you're at the end, reach out to us, reach out to the suicide hotline as always, because there's always a light, and you may not be able to see it right now, but there's always a brighter side of things. So did I miss anything with that, Christy?
I don't think so. Unless we want to just talk about next week.
Oh yeah. Let's talk about next week. Guys, so I am going to have some big news next week. And I'll leave it there so you can bask in the excitement of next week. So Friday, 10 a.m. next week, we're going to be talking about the best ways to prevent anxiety. So the best ways to reduce and prevent anxiety. And in this conversation, guys, keep an eye out for my post. We may dial that into certain environments, and perhaps we'll break this one up because this one's a big conversation. And anxiety, mental and emotional wellness issues is a big, important topic, as you're well aware, within our spectrum of what we cover. So perhaps, Christy, if you're not opposed, we'll break it out to say preventing anxiety in the workplace. And maybe we'll preventing anxiety, anxious moments at home.
Like it.
And we'll break it out into a couple sessions if we can.
Sounds good.
So, right here next Friday. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And we'll see you next time. Bye, guys.
Bye.